Hello, Bloom along peeps. Today we're heading into week 4 and we are continuing on with straight piecing, no curves just yet, but we're going to be focusing on 2 different blocks today. First of all is the hourglass block, and this is only required if you're doing the Bloom 1 layout. If you're doing Bloom 2, there are no hourglass blocks. But both layouts include the bird in the air block. Here it is here, and we'll be doing both of these this week. Okay, so let's get started. We're well underway into our sewing. I'm super stoked. Next week we'll start dealing with the curves, so just take your time, deep breaths. Let's get at it. This week we're focusing on 2 different blocks, the hourglass block and the bird in the air block. If you're making Bloom 1, both blocks are required. If you're making Bloom 2, there's no hourglass block, only the bird in the air block, and there are more curves in Bloom 2. Just FYI, don't worry about that. We'll get there and we'll deal with it when we need to. Okay, so the hourglass block is made up of 4 triangles, and unlike the HSTs that we made last week, you're not attaching the long sides of the triangles, you're attaching these shorter sides together, okay? But the first thing you really want to do is lay your pieces out according to your quadrant layout. There's D3 and C4, okay? And you'll be making 4 of this one and 4 of this one. The only reason these are different is because it's a mirrored block, okay? So the order of the colors is slightly different. So let's focus first on C4, which is made up of color 12, which looks like this. 3 goes here, 4 here, 5 here. Okay, and then D3 is opposite. We've got 12 over here, 3, 4, and 5. Now, it doesn't look like it's mirrored, but when I rotate this block, you'll see that these two are mirrored. Okay, so, and I'm keeping this oriented the way my layout is. You don't have to, but I'm doing 4 that look like this, 4 that look like this. Okay, and to keep myself from getting confused, I might even just focus on making all the C4s first and then go back and make all the D3s. Up to you how you like to do it, but here's how you make them. It's simple. You're just putting these into pairs. So I'm pairing this to this. Okay, I'm lining them up and I'm putting pins in. So I'll be stitching along this line, and rather than carrying it over to my machine and forgetting which line I have to sew, I'm going to put my pin in right away. And you can absolutely pin all these pairs, chain piece them, and then bring them back and then prep them to iron them. But before you iron, I do want to show how you can nest your seams, okay, to line up that center points. So I'll put in my pins, and I'm just going to take this to my machine. So 1/4 inch seam, make sure you check your 1/4 inch because accuracy helps, again, as usual. Okay, so let's see how this looks. Okay, I've sewn them. We're going to open them up and we're going to iron them and then put the 2 halves together. But first we want to check our layout. There's the 12, there's the 5, there's 3 and 4, okay? And what we want to do is iron our seams in opposite directions. So I might iron this seam towards the teal. Doesn't really matter which one you're ironing towards. This one, the seam will go towards the pink. Okay, I just give it a nice little finger press to get into the seam, and then I would iron them opposite sides. Or if you finger pressed really well, you can just go ahead and pair them up. So you can see the seam is going in this direction on this one. It's going in the opposite direction. And again, we're bumping that folded edge up against the other one. It's not overlapping. It's just bumping up against the other one. Okay? When you do that, you end up having your seams lined up really nicely. I would put a pin in here. Now, if you want, you can put your pin this way through the stitched seams to keep them really lined up. Pin how you normally pin. I like to pin this way. This is how I was taught. This is a fairly large piece too, so if you don't want this to slip around, especially if you're making the large version of the quilt, okay? There, this is ready to go. I'll put this through my machine and then give it a really good press. And for this center seam, you can press the seam open or to one side, it's up to you, okay? Let's have a look. I have the two halves sewn together. I haven't pressed this yet. Before I open this, I could trim off these little dog ears, and I would trim 45-degree angle. You can also do this after you've pressed everything. Just get rid of the dog ears. And then when we open this up, look at, you've got this really nice center. All the points are lined up. And then you're going to give this a really good press. Look, there's still some dog ears there that I need to deal with. That's fine, trim them off afterwards. And measure this. This should measure, if you're making the large quilt, this should measure 8.5 inches, like all your other unfinished blocks. If you're making the medium-sized quilt, it should measure 6.5 inches, okay? If you're a little bit short, if this is measuring just more than 8.25 inches, you're okay, because you've still got enough seam allowance that you can fake it till you make it and get it into your quilt. If it's anything short of 8.25 or 6.25 inches, then it's too small. Then you need to like reassess and check your seam allowances, okay? But there are ways to fake imperfect sized blocks, and I always say finished is better than perfect, right? So even when I measure this, yeah, I'm coming in at like just a touch, like 1/8 of an inch under 8.5 inches, and I'm not gonna sweat it because I can get it into my quilt by using pins to help me manipulate everything and stretch it where it needs to stretch and get it to work. So don't sweat it if it's not exact. All right, if it's too large, if it's more than 8.5, or for the medium size 6.5, then you do want to trim down, and you'll want to trim evenly all the way around, okay? All right, that's it. That's the hourglass block. They're really simple and easy. Once you've made 4 of each, you should orient them the way that they look in your diagram. So I've labeled this one, there's 4 D3s, and they look like this in my quadrant. And then 4 C4s, they look like this one. I've oriented them and I've marked them in the top left corner, okay? That means when we're putting everything together in the end, you'll be able to lay out all your blocks with your labels on the top left. It makes things go together really quickly and easily. All right, so that's the hourglass block. Let's move on to the birds in the air block. For birds in the air, I've pulled all the pieces I need to make my block, and perhaps last week you already sewed a half square triangle as per the directions from last week, but if not, that's okay, because you can do it this week, okay? So there is this one center small half square triangle. Let's have a look at how this block lays out. If you already made your half square triangles last week, then you'll have these little half square triangles that look like this. It'll already be sewn and pressed, and that's fantastic. So this is the start of your bird in the air. You start with this, okay? And then you're going to add one this way. So you'll sew this onto here, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Sew that first. Then you will sew on, not this way, you'll sew it on this way. Okay, open, press it. You'll have this whole half done, and then you're just adding one of these larger triangles to the other side. And you'll be sewing this on top of this one so you can see where you're sewing and you're not losing any points. So first, let's do this. Okay, if you haven't done them already, I'm going to sew this. I'm not going to show you again. You can look at last week's tutorial, but I will be sewing this pair together first. Through the magic of the internet, here is the finished half square triangle, all right? And I'll add this one to here. So do you see how this little point sticks out? It should stick out, okay? That eventually gets trimmed off, but for now, you're lining up these straight sides. So you'll flip this over line up the straight sides, and you're going to stitch right along here. And then this should be overlapping about 1/4 of an inch, all right? I'm just going to turn it this way, pin in place, sew along there. And then once I've got the sewing done, I will iron this new little piece away, okay? So iron just towards this piece, all right? I've got this first piece attached now, and the seam is ironed towards this little piece here. And see this little dog ear? Just trim that off, either using your rotary and a ruler or scissors. Trim away that little bit. And now you're going to add this one, just like the other one. You want this little point to overlap, and you're lining up the flat sides, okay? So I will turn it this way, and I'll stitch along here at 1/4 of an inch, and then again, I will be ironing towards this piece. All right, let's see how that looks. Okay, so now we've got this half finished, but first I want to show you one thing. There's another little dog ear. You should trim that off as well. This time I'm just going to use a ruler and a rotary just to make it nice and smooth. Okay, a nice good smooth cut. Once you've got that dog ear trimmed off, I want you to have a look, because see this extra bit right here, that is your seam allowance. And that, you need that because you don't want to lose your point. That becomes your seam allowance, and your point remains really nicely. And I'm going to show you how to ensure that you don't lose your points. And if you do, if they're not perfect, if you don't get it exact, do not worry about it. Finished is better than perfect, like I just said, okay? So you're lining these up, and you can see, because of the way I've ironed, you can see the stitching going this way, stitching going this way. X marks the spot. That's where you want your needle to hit as you're coming along here. If you go past that X, you're going to lose your point, okay? So you might want to just either make a little mark with a pen if you have a hard time seeing it, or just put a pin there, all right? That's what you're aiming for when you're stitching. So when I'm stitching my 2 halves together, I want my needle to stitch right across that X, right there. Okay, and then that way you don't lose a point. If you've got, say that you put these together and you've got less than 1/4 inch seam allowance, then I just fudge it a little bit, and I would go like this. Line the outer sides up together with the solid piece. So if you're short on this seam allowance, that's okay, just fudge it like this a little bit, okay? So you've got a little extra on the other piece, but honestly, if your points aren't perfect, if you lose a point here or there, or you're new to quilting or you're seasoned quilter, and like, listen, I don't always have perfect points. I like to have finished quilts. And so I look at things and say, can I live with this? And if I can, I keep going. And if it's something that's really gonna bother me, then I stitch rip it. But honestly, when I'm underneath a quilt and I'm cozy and I'm watching a movie, I'm not gonna look down and see an imperfect point and be all that upset about it. I'm just gonna be happy that I have something to get under. Okay, let's stitch this together and have a look. Okay, here's the bird in the air. Again, I can trim off these points before I open it up to iron it, and I trim just at 45 degrees. You can also do this after you've ironed. Okay, and I'm going to open this up for the big moment. Da, 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 da. Okay, all right, look at this. This one looks pretty good. I didn't lose my point. And when I'm ironing this one, because you've already got some bulk from this seam here, you want to iron it towards the solid triangle, okay? So just iron that seam this way. Give it a good finger press first, okay? And then iron that block up, and it should measure 8.5 inches if you're making the large, 6.5 inches if you're making the medium. Let's have a look. Moment of reckoning. Ooh, it's 8.5. Exactly. Whew, okay, that one is good to go. It passes. All right, so finish up both of these blocks, mark them off on your layouts as finished, and you are done for the week, friends. Take a break, have a glass of whatever it is that you like to drink, and enjoy the week. If you've got any questions, be sure to ask them in the comments or save them for our live check-in. I hope this was helpful. That's it. Happy sewing.